Hello, Year 11, and whoever else wants to watch this film. We're going to be looking at War Photographer today with Caroline Duffy. Now, remember, this is just a very, very brief reminder, revision session. It's not going to be teaching you anything completely new. It's just getting you to think about things and to think about the most important things that this poem is about. The themes, the tone, the mood, the idea, not heavy analysis. So let's just go straight on to War Photographer. So obviously the whole point of War Photographer, it is called War Photographer. Very, very funny. All right, so it's called War Photographer, and the fact is that it's all about a man. However, it is not just about a man. It is about a man and what he has to deal with, and there's this personal element to the poem, but at the same time, it's also about society's desensitization towards the horror of war. And the idea that both the war photographer has to become desensitized. So he sees these terrible things and he doesn't react in an emotional way when he's doing things. But at the same time, he is doing a job. But the people who he is taking these pictures for, so people at home, us, people who watch the news, and this is pre sort of social media, so it'd been reading the news and newspapers. They look at the pictures, they have a little cry, and then they go to the pub. So the desensitization and what actually is the point of taking these pictures, because what does it do? Does it change anything? So, if you watch a crime and you do not help, are you just as bad as the criminal? These are things that you can just think about in preparation for this poem. He is looking, the war photographer is looking at the most awful things and he's not doing anything about it. He's just taking pictures. Nowadays, if a terrible thing occurs, say, I don't know, there's a fight or a car crash, if people get their phones out and start recording it, everyone else is outraged. That's disgusting. You shouldn't have done that. But that's what the war photographer is doing. He's taking pictures of tragedy. But because he's taking pictures of tragedy, does that make it right? Is it right to just look on? But do you think actually we are immune to the horror of war and it does not affect us like it should? I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute and you can just imagine, are you actually shocked by them, or have we become so desensitized that we don't really care? And also, what is the point of learning about tragedy? This is another reason why the war photographer might actually be so impassive when he goes back up into the plane. Firstly, because, excuse me, he's become desensitized to it. But secondly, because he knows actually there's no point. There's no real, he can't change anything. He can't make a change. He tries to show people the reality of war, but actually, does it matter? Do things change? So I'm going to show you 5 pictures and I want you to rank them in order of the most to the least shocking. So I'm just going to go through quickly again. If you want to look at it in more detail, then you can. Now, these are all obviously moving and quite horrific pictures. But when I've done this with my class beforehand, we've had very, very good discussions about this, but actually there's not one of these that make you go, apart from one. And the one that it is E. Now, the reason why it is E is because this is actually a picture of a young Syrian refugee who drowned. So the picture, if we go back to it there, a lot of times I put this on, it happened about a few years ago, but when I put this on, a lot of students don't actually realise that it is a toddler who has drowned. He was fleeing Syria. And when you have a look at this one, especially, that little picture down there of him lying, I mean, even me now, if I am looking at this picture, I don't know if it's because I'm a mother or because I know what happens, but there is something that is very primitive in my reaction to that one. So out of all of those pictures, and I know obviously because I've researched them, all of those pictures are of something awful, but this one is the one that makes me the most, I think, sad, because first of all it's modern and secondly it's a child. And what is actually interesting, and again, this is sort of in addition, you don't have to talk about this, but this is again a good idea about the sort of things that we are doing. This photo, when it was actually produced and it went around the world, everyone was like, that's the most awful thing I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like that. It's terrible. It's really, really bad. And actually, the father said, nothing's changed. I can't get that up, I'm afraid. So the father actually was saying, this was the picture of my son. Everyone said that we would help the refugees, but we haven't. And so you think to yourself, right, well, this is the most, I think in general, the kind of like a modern equivalent of what war photographer is actually about. A terrible, terrible, terrible picture that really affects people, and yet nothing changes. You know, the fact that we live in a society that initially was shocked and saddened by this, but then becomes desensitized and can look at a picture of a drowned toddler and think that it is acceptable. Well, you know, it's not acceptable, but can think that it is perchance normality now. We've seen it. It happens. We hear about boats capsizing and people dying all the time. Whatever. You know, there's a comment there, isn't there, about society and about how things in society have been. So we'll just have a quick look at actually the war photographer video, and we can have a look and see. So just bear with while I get it up. It'll probably take a little bit of time. So here we go. So again, it's called war photographer. So it's about the singular person, the actual war photographer. But what you can see is that you can actually compare. There's a lot of contrast in this poem. So you have obviously the very obvious comparison between the horror of he is in war and where he is in rural England. So you've got things like the metaphor spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. There's something rigid about this. He's trying to control the chaos that he sees. It talks about as though it were a church and he were a priest. So he's taking great care and reverence with the development of these photos. He knows how important they are. He knows how important they have been to people and to him and to the people that he's taken pictures of. Belfast, Phnom Penh, they're all places, not so much you hear about them now, but certainly years ago they were places where there was trouble. He has a job to do. That's a very simple statement. Does it take away his horror? No. Does it mean that he's become desensitized? Probably. All right. And they did not tremble then, although they seem to now. So when he's actually taking the picture, he's totally focused. But now he comes back, and I suppose he's got the quietness of being in the dark room, and actually he starts, to tremble because he realizes how awful things are. Rural England, ordinary pain, simple weather can dispel. So again, you've got the contrast between the horror of where he was and, the lack of awfulness that we are in England. And he's saying, simple weather can dispel ordinary pain. You're feeling down in dumps, you get a happy day and the sun shines, things change. That's not the case if you live in a war zone. What else is you might notice here is the fact that you have these rhyming couplets at the end of each stanza. So each stanza is very ordered again, which is interesting because it juxtaposes with the chaos that he obviously feels when he is in the war zone. And if you're watching something and you're kind of trying to comprehend the brutality of man and how awful man is and what man is doing to man, and then you come back and you think to yourself, that was awful, and you've actually got the chance to think it through. A stranger's features, and it's interesting that they use the word stranger. He sees these people and he doesn't know them, he's just commenting on them, he's taking pictures to show the world what's happening, but does the world really care? He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. So there is that element of yes, it is imperative that we take pictures, that we are able to understand the brutality of the world, and we are knowing about what goes on in the world, whether we do anything about it or not. You know, he's completely emotionally detached. So, you know, and what this poem does very well is it looks at the individual. So it looks at the war photographer. It's talking about him. It's talking about what he does, where he is now, how that contrasts to where he was. You've got the sinister images that are juxtaposed against the idyllic landscape of England, which is rural England, bucolic and lovely. And then the 100 agonies in black and white. And again, the 100 agonies, that metaphor that compares to the spools of suffering that you've got up there. And then from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday supplement. Now, again, this is something that came before the advent of social media. So I don't know if your parents still do, but people used to buy bigger papers on Sunday because obviously you used to have more time. And the Sunday supplements would usually include a magazine that would be in colour, or different types of magazines. And so what you've got here is that really, I don't know, the contrast between somebody who is, so his editor who wasn't there is picking out the best one, and they're not picking out the best one to show, you know, the true horror. They're picking the best one that looks the best, that will have the biggest impact. And the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. And I think, yes, this poem is about a war photographer. Yes, this poem is about the horrors he sees. Yes, this poem is all about the contrast in his life, the emotional detachment that he has. But I think, again, we're talking about the expansion. This poem is actually a lot more than that. This poem is about the fact that we live a shallow and a meaningless existence when it comes to the response to these pictures. We look at them, we cry, we're affected, and then we go for lunch and have beer. And actually, this poem, it wasn't, he has a job to do, and it is a must, and he should do that, but it's all futile. There's, you know, what does it do? What does it change? Obviously, it should change things. We should be offering help. We should be outraged. We are outraged, but we're only outraged for a little bit, and then, you know, we're sort of not outraged anymore. And so it's a really powerful, you know, you can talk about, if you're going to talk about things, you can talk about in terms of the links to other poems in the anthology. You can obviously talk about memories. So a really good one would compare it to would be the memories of Remains. What you could talk about there is the fact that they're both about memories of war zones. The memories in Remains tend to be very strong and have affected him, whereas the memories in War Photographer affect him very little. You get that shake of his hands and that's it. The memories in Remains are very much a part of him, whereas the memories in War Photographer are expansive, and his memories then go on to teach the world and people that read the papers about what's happening. So that's a very good one that you could talk about in terms of memories. You could talk about it in terms of feelings, in the fact that he doesn't seem to have strong feelings, and that can compare to another, you know, even Remains, the guilt that he feels. Those two are really, really strong when you can talk about the comparisons between them. And I think what you're looking at here is it's all about looking back and the effect that it has, and these ideas, the sense of person, the sense of self, the sense of effect that it has. I just think that this is a poem, yes, it's about one person, but it's also about the bigger social response to a picture, which is shockingly lacking. And then he stares impassively at where he earns a living, and they do not care. So you get a sense that the war photographer is probably thinking to himself, why do I do this? Why do I bother? There's absolutely no point. You know, it's not something that makes a difference. And I think if you're putting yourself, you know, in that terrible situation all the time, and yet you're not getting anything back, you know, it's so disheartening, and it must be crushing for him. So on that happy note, thank you very much for watching, and I hope this helps you to remember what the poem's about.